The woman's own scream pierced the midnight air as the razor blade found its mark, fulfilling the final line of a prophecy she had written in her own hand 3 days earlier. Blood pooled around the crystal ball that had made her fortune, its surface reflecting not the future, but the twisted face of a woman who had seen too much of what was to come. Welcome to a tale where prophecy and madness intertwined in the parlors of 1920s New Orleans, where Madame Isabella Salazar built an empire on glimpses of tomorrow, only to become the architect of her own destruction. This is the story of a fortune-teller who discovered that some futures cannot be changed, only embraced with open arms and a sharpened blade. In the sultry summer of 1923, the French Quarter of New Orleans pulsed with jazz music, bootleg whiskey, and the desperate hopes of those seeking glimpses beyond the veil of time. Among the narrow streets lined with wrought-iron balconies and gaslit corners, Madame Isabella Salazar had carved out a domain that attracted both society matrons and common laborers, all seeking answers to questions they dared not voice elsewhere. Her parlor occupied the ground floor of a Creole townhouse on Dauphin Street, its windows draped in burgundy velvet, its air thick with sandalwood incense and the metallic tang of something darker. Those who entered found themselves in a world removed from the rational daylight of the modern age, a sanctuary where crystal balls caught candlelight like trapped souls, and tarot cards whispered secrets in languages older than memory. Isabella Salazar had arrived in New Orleans 5 years earlier, a woman of perhaps 30, with olive skin, raven-black hair, and eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes. She claimed heritage from both Spanish nobility and Romani wanderers, though neighbors suspected her accent was as carefully constructed as her reputation. What mattered was not her origins, but her gift, for Madame Salazar possessed an uncanny ability to peer into the threads of fate and reveal what tomorrow held for those brave enough to cross her palm with silver. Her predictions were legendary in their accuracy. She had warned Mrs. Evangeline Thibodeau that her husband would suffer a heart attack on the anniversary of their wedding, allowing the woman to summon a doctor in time to save his life. She had advised young Thomas Broussard to avoid the riverboat Magnolia Belle on a specific Tuesday in March, and that very vessel had exploded in a boiler accident that claimed 17 lives. She had told the banker Cornelius Wade that his trusted partner was embezzling funds, and the subsequent investigation had revealed theft totaling nearly $50,000. Such successes built more than reputation. They built dependency. Wealthy clients began consulting Madame Salazar before every major decision, from business investments to marriage proposals. The poor scraped together coins to learn if their loved ones would return from dangerous work in the oil fields, or if their children would survive the fever that swept through the tenements each summer. Isabella Salazar became the unofficial oracle of New Orleans, a position that brought her both prosperity and a burden that grew heavier with each passing month. The first sign that something had shifted in the cosmic balance came in October of 1923, when Isabella began experiencing what she privately termed the episodes. These were not the controlled visions that came during readings, when she would gaze into her crystal ball or lay out the cards with practiced precision. The episodes struck without warning, flooding her consciousness with images so vivid and terrible that she would find herself on the floor of her parlor, blood streaming from her nose, her hands clawing at the Persian carpet as if trying to anchor herself to the present moment. In these seizures of unwanted sight, she saw fragments of futures that defied comprehension, a great war that would consume the world in flames more terrible than any conflict in human history. Cities reduced to ash in an instant by weapons that harnessed the power of the sun itself, machines that could think and calculate faster than human minds, eventually turning against their creators, plagues that would sweep across continents in a matter of weeks, and beneath it all, a creeping darkness that seemed to laugh at humanity's attempts to control its own destiny. Dr. Henri Gautreau, the physician who had attended Isabella since her arrival in the city, could find no medical explanation for her condition. Her physical health was excellent, her heart strong, her reflexes sharp. Yet the episodes increased in frequency and intensity, sometimes occurring 3 or 4 times in a single week. After each attack, Isabella would spend hours writing in a leather-bound journal, recording every detail of what she had witnessed, as if documentation might somehow diminish the horror of her visions. It was during this period that Isabella began to notice a disturbing pattern in her professional readings. The futures she revealed to clients were growing darker, more violent, tinged with a malevolence that seemed to seep from some poisoned well of tomorrow. The society matrons who came seeking reassurance about their children's prospects left her parlor pale and shaken. Young lovers who had hoped to hear of wedding bells instead learned of betrayal and heartbreak that awaited them in the coming years. Isabella tried to soften her predictions, to present them in language that offered hope even in the face of inevitable tragedy. But the visions would not be denied their truth, and increasingly she found herself speaking words that chilled her own blood. She warned the merchant Antoine Dupuis that his youngest son would die in a fire on his 21st birthday. She told the seamstress Marie Boudreau that her husband would abandon her for another woman, taking their savings and leaving her destitute. She informed the judge, Octavius Beauregard, that corruption within his own court would destroy his career and reputation within the year. Each prediction came to pass exactly as foretold, cementing Isabella's reputation while simultaneously isolating her from the very community she served. People began to cross themselves when they saw her on the street, whispering that she carried a curse rather than a gift. Some claimed she did not merely predict tragedies, but somehow caused them through her prophecies, as if her words had the power to reshape reality according to their dark vision. The truth, Isabella knew, was more complex and infinitely more terrifying. She was not creating these futures, but witnessing them, experiencing them with a clarity that suggested she was somehow connected to the cosmic machinery that governed fate itself. And that machinery, she had begun to suspect, was broken, grinding toward outcomes that would consume not just individuals but entire civilizations. Her journal from this period, discovered after her death, reveals the depth of her growing obsession with what she called the pattern. Entry after entry detailed her attempts to understand the structure of fate, to map the connections between individual destinies and the larger tapestry of human existence. She drew elaborate diagrams showing how personal tragedies interconnected with historical events, how the death of a child in New Orleans might somehow influence the rise of a dictator in Europe, how a moment of kindness between strangers could ripple outward to prevent a war that would otherwise claim millions of lives. But the more Isabella studied the pattern, the more convinced she became that something fundamental had gone wrong with the natural order. The futures she witnessed were not simply dark, but actively malevolent, as if some hostile intelligence had infected the stream of time itself. Her visions showed her worlds where humanity's greatest achievements became instruments of its destruction, where scientific progress led not to enlightenment, but to new and more efficient forms of suffering. It was in November of 1923 that Isabella first saw her own death. The vision came not during one of her uncontrolled episodes, but in the middle of a routine reading for a client, Mrs. Josephine Marigny, who had come seeking advice about her daughter's upcoming engagement. Isabella had just laid out the cards, her hands moving in the familiar patterns that had guided hundreds of successful predictions, when the present moment dissolved around her. She stood in her own parlor, but it was transformed, the familiar furnishings rearranged as if for some terrible ceremony. Candles burned in configurations that hurt to look upon, their flames casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The crystal ball at the center of the table pulsed with an inner light that revealed not the future, but something far worse, the face of Isabella Salazar herself, older, haggard, her storm cloud eyes filled with a knowledge that had driven her to the brink of madness. In the vision, she watched herself pick up a straight razor that gleamed with unnatural sharpness. She saw her own hand, steady despite the horror of what it was about to accomplish, draw the blade across her throat with surgical precision. She felt the pain, tasted the copper flood that filled her mouth, experienced the final moments as her consciousness fled from a body that could no longer contain the weight of what she had seen. But most disturbing of all, she heard her own voice, speaking words of prophecy, even as her life's blood pooled around the crystal ball. The seer becomes the seen, the prophet becomes the prophecy, and in my death the pattern completes itself. What has been written cannot be unwritten, what has been spoken cannot be unspoken. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Isabella gasping in her chair while Mrs. Marigny stared in alarm. The cards, scattered across the table, showed a reading of unrelieved darkness, the tower, death, and the devil, arranged in a configuration that Isabella had never seen before, but somehow understood with perfect clarity. It was her own fate, laid out in symbols that admitted no interpretation but the most literal. Mrs. Marigny left without payment or prediction, her face pale with the intuition that she had witnessed something beyond the normal scope of fortune-telling. Isabella remained alone in her parlor, staring at the cards that had revealed her destiny with the same pitiless accuracy she had brought to the fates of others. Over the following days, Isabella threw herself into research with manic intensity. She consulted grimoires and texts on divination that she had collected over the years, seeking some precedent for her situation, some way to break the chain of causation that led inexorably to her own destruction. She wrote letters to practitioners of the occult arts in other cities, describing her visions in coded language and begging for insights that might offer an escape from the future she had witnessed. The responses, when they came, offered little comfort. A voodoo priestess in Haiti warned that some prophecies were woven into the fabric of reality itself and could not be altered without unraveling the entire cosmos. A spiritualist in Chicago suggested that Isabella's visions might be messages from entities that existed outside normal time, beings that used human consciousness as a window into the material world. An elderly professor of folklore from Miskatonic University in Massachusetts wrote that certain individuals throughout history had been cursed with perfect foresight of their own doom, and that all attempts to change such fates had only served to bring them about more surely. As December approached, Isabella found herself trapped in a paradox that grew more suffocating with each passing day. The vision of her suicide was so clear, so detailed, that she could smell the sandalwood incense that would burn in her parlor on that final night, could feel the weight of the razor in her hand, could hear the exact words she would speak as her life ebbed away. Yet the very accuracy of the prophecy suggested that it was unalterable, that her attempts to avoid her fate would somehow become the means by which it was accomplished. She stopped seeing clients, claiming illness when regular customers inquired about appointments. The few visitors who glimpsed her during this period reported that she had aged years in a matter of weeks. Her raven hair shot through with silver, her storm cloud eyes haunted by visions that she refused to share. She was observed walking the French Quarter at all hours, muttering to herself in languages that sounded older than any European tongue, her hands stained with ink from the constant writing in her journal. Dr. Gautreau, summoned by concerned neighbors, found Isabella in a state of nervous exhaustion that bordered on complete collapse. She had lost significant weight, her olive skin had acquired a grayish pallor, and she exhibited tremors that seemed to worsen whenever she attempted to discuss her condition. The physician prescribed rest and tonics, but Isabella refused all treatment, claiming that her time was measured not in recovery, but in the fulfillment of obligations she could not explain. It was during one of these medical consultations that Isabella made a statement that would haunt Dr. Gautreau for the rest of his life. "Doctor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what would you do if you knew with absolute certainty that your death would serve a purpose beyond your understanding? If you saw that your sacrifice would prevent something so terrible that the very cosmos would be grateful for your willing participation in its grand design?" When the physician pressed her to explain, Isabella merely smiled, an expression devoid of warmth or hope. "The pattern demands completion, Doctor. I have seen the threads that connect all things, and I understand now that some of us are born not to live, but to die at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right way, to maintain the balance that keeps darker forces at bay." The journal entries from Isabella's final weeks reveal a mind grappling with concepts that stretch the boundaries of human comprehension. She wrote extensively about what she termed the Watchers, entities that observed the flow of time from some position outside normal reality. According to her visions, these beings had identified certain individuals throughout history whose deaths at specific moments would serve to maintain cosmic stability, preventing timelines that led to humanity's complete annihilation. Isabella came to believe that her own death was one such crucial event, a sacrifice that would somehow deflect the darkest of the futures she had witnessed in her uncontrolled visions. The great wars, the devastating plagues, the triumph of machines over their creators, all of these catastrophes could be avoided, but only if she played her role in the pattern with perfect fidelity to what she had foreseen. This realization brought with it a strange sort of peace. Isabella's final journal entries, written in the days leading up to her prophesied death, show none of the panic or desperation that had characterized her writing since October. Instead, she wrote with the calm acceptance of someone who had found meaning in what initially appeared to be meaningless suffering. "I understand now," she wrote 3 days before the end, "that prophecy is not about revealing the future, but about accepting one's place in the eternal dance between order and chaos. I have been chosen not for my gift of sight, but for my willingness to see clearly, even when that sight leads to my own destruction. The pattern is beautiful in its complexity, terrible in its demands, but ultimately just in its design." On December 15th, 1923, Isabella Salazar began the final ritual that would transform her from prophet to prophecy. She spent the morning arranging her parlor exactly as she had seen it in her vision, moving furniture, placing candles in the precise configurations that had been burned into her memory. She donned a black dress that she had purchased specifically for the occasion, its fabric imported from Spain and embroidered with silver thread in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. As evening fell, Isabella seated herself at the table where she had conducted thousands of readings, the crystal ball before her reflecting the dancing flames of the surrounding candles. She opened her journal to a blank page and began to write, her hand moving with mechanical precision as she recorded the final prophecy that would define not just her death, but the cosmic significance of her sacrifice. "The seer becomes the seen," she wrote, the words appearing on the page as if guided by some force beyond her conscious will. "The prophet becomes the prophecy, and in my death, the pattern completes itself. What has been written cannot be unwritten. What has been spoken cannot be unspoken. Let those who come after understand that some futures can only be prevented through the willing surrender of those who have glimpsed them. The watchers are satisfied, the balance is maintained, and the darkest timeline fades into the realm of might-have-beens." At precisely midnight, as church bells throughout the French Quarter began to toll the beginning of a new day, Isabella Salazar picked up the straight razor that lay beside her journal. The blade caught the candlelight, its edge sharp enough to part the very air through which it moved. She held it up to her throat, feeling the cold metal against skin that would soon be forever stilled. But in that final moment before the prophecy's fulfillment, Isabella experienced one last vision, perhaps the most important of her entire life. She saw the futures that her death would prevent, cities that would not burn, children who would live to see old age, discoveries that would be made for the benefit rather than the destruction of humanity. She saw herself as a thread in a tapestry so vast that no single human mind could comprehend its full scope, but she understood that her thread, however brief, was essential to the beauty and integrity of the whole. With that understanding came a final moment of perfect peace. Isabella Salazar, fortune-teller of New Orleans, prophet of doom and herald of salvation, drew the razor across her throat in one swift, sure motion, her own scream piercing the midnight air as the final line of her prophecy was written not in ink, but in blood. The crystal ball reflected her face as consciousness faded, showing not the future, but the eternal present, the moment when prophecy and reality converged in perfect, terrible harmony. Her hand released the razor, and it clattered to the floor beside the pool of blood that spread slowly across the Persian carpet, carrying with it the dreams and visions that had both blessed and cursed the woman who had seen too much of what was to come. Isabella Salazar was found the next morning by her landlord, who had come to collect the rent, and discovered the parlor transformed into a scene from a nightmare. The police investigation, led by Detective Maurice Taschereau, concluded that she had taken her own life while in a state of mental disturbance, brought on by her work as a fortune-teller. The case was closed quickly, with little fanfare, the authorities eager to avoid the sort of sensational publicity that might attract unwanted attention from the growing population of tourists who came to New Orleans seeking exotic thrills. But those who had known Isabella understood that her death was something more than suicide, born of madness. Her regular clients reported that their own futures, which had looked so dark in her final readings, began to brighten in the weeks following her death. Mrs. Evangeline Thibodeau's husband recovered fully from his heart condition and lived another 30 years. Thomas Broussard found unexpected prosperity in a business venture that he had been warned against by other fortune-tellers. Judge Octavius Beauregard exposed the corruption in his court and became a champion of legal reform rather than its victim. Most mysteriously, Isabella's journal was found to contain predictions that extended far beyond her own death. Prophecies written in her unmistakable handwriting, but dated after December 15, 1923. These entries spoke of averted disasters, of timelines that had been severed before they could reach their terrible conclusions, of a cosmic balance that had been restored through the sacrifice of one who had been willing to see clearly, even unto death. The journal eventually found its way into the collection of Miskatonic University, where it remains to this day, a testament to the strange and terrible burden carried by those who are chosen to glimpse the patterns that govern fate itself. Scholars who have studied Isabella's final writings speak of prophecies so accurate and detailed that they seem to have been written by someone observing events from a position outside time itself, as if death had not ended her gift of sight, but merely changed its perspective. In the years since her death, others have claimed to have encountered Isabella Salazar in dreams and visions, always at moments when individuals face choices that could reshape their destinies. These apparitions offer no comfort or easy answers, but they provide something perhaps more valuable: the understanding that even the darkest future can be changed by those willing to sacrifice their own comfort for the greater pattern that connects all things. The parlor on Dauphine Street stands empty now, its windows boarded up, its door locked against visitors who might seek the services of a fortune-teller who no longer dwells among the living. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the veil between worlds grows thin, Local residents report seeing candlelight flickering behind the burgundy curtains, and some claim to hear a woman's voice speaking prophecies in languages older than memory. Whether these are echoes of the past or glimpses of a future where death itself becomes another tool in the arsenal of those who serve the cosmic order, no one can say for certain. What remains clear is that Madame Isabella Salazar achieved in death what few accomplish in life, the transformation from individual consciousness into an eternal principle, a living prophecy that continues to shape the fates of those who dare to seek truth beyond the comfortable lies of ordinary existence. And so we come to the end of our tale, where prophecy and reality merged in a moment of perfect, terrible clarity. Isabella Salazar discovered that some futures cannot be changed, only embraced, and that the greatest gift of sight is not the ability to see what will come to pass, but the courage to accept one's role in the pattern that connects all things. In her death, she became something more than human. She became prophecy itself, a living testament to the truth that some sacrifices echo through eternity, shaping destinies in ways that no mortal mind can fully comprehend. Sleep well, dear listeners, and remember that the future is not written in stone, but in the choices we make and the prices we are willing to pay for the worlds we wish to create. And if you should ever find yourself in New Orleans, walking the narrow streets of the French Quarter on a night when the moon hides its face and the shadows seem to whisper of things beyond mortal understanding, you might just glimpse a figure in a black dress embroidered with silver thread, standing at the crossroads where prophecy and reality converge in the eternal dance of fate and free will.